Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I am Douglas Northrup. As many of you know, I'm the acting director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, which is hosting this event. I'm also a professor of history and Middle East studies here at U of M. And I'm very pleased to be here to just introduce today's lecture. Before doing that, I just wanted to say one very brief item to advertise our next cool, exciting, upcoming event. Some of you might have heard there's a spring break coming next week, if anyone's going to forget that. Right after the break, we have another event scheduled on March 10th in the Forum Hall of Salmer Commons. We're calling it an Emerging Issues lecture by Dr. Gabriela Gricius, who's coming here from Constance in Europe to speak on why Greenland matters now. This is an unusual opportunity that we don't usually have here. So please put that on your calendars. Now our WCEE lecture, The Roots of Russia's War on Ukraine. It's presented to you by Professor Serhy Yekelchyk, who's a professor of history and Slavic studies at the University of Victoria. We're very grateful for our co-sponsors in the history department and also CREASE, the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies here. I'm not going to say much. Serhy Yekelchyk was born and educated in Ukraine. It was part of the Soviet Union at the time that happened. He then came to this side of the world. He was educated at the University of Alberta, after which his life reached a pinnacle when he moved to Ann Arbor. Okay. This is the silver anniversary of his year as a postdoctoral fellow here, and I'm sure that's what shaped everything that came later, including the 8 books that he wrote afterwards. That's a pretty remarkable number, I think we can say. These range from surveys of Ukrainian history to monographs on Stalinism. And I'll just mention one, which is his very excellent primer, Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know. I understand he's working on a 3rd edition of that now. Please join me in giving Professor Yekelchyk a warm welcome.
Thank you, Professor Northrop, for your generous introduction. Just give me a second here to connect, put everything. I'm all wired, as you can see, so I need to choose my words responsibly. So I was here 25 years ago as a hopeful postdoc. I know there are postdocs in the room. There is some hope at the end of the tunnel. And ironically, it was never better than now. But the reason for that is, of course, the war. Right? So it is quite sad to think of the prominence of Ukrainian studies in North American academia now as resulting from the Russian invasion. However, this allowed scholars of Ukrainian history, literature, and culture to propose the rethinking of how the history of that country has been taught previously and what needs to be modified. And to some degree, it is connected to what is going to become a central topic of my talk today, namely the prominence of historical arguments in the Russian explanations for the war. And I have to qualify it by saying that the main Russian explanations for the war are different, but the historical topics are prominent for a reason, and I'm going to engage with the reason for that. So you have probably heard the traditional official Russian explanation, which amazingly is supported by some colleagues in North America, namely to the fact that the reason for Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is the United States and Canada and the UK. But primarily, NATO as an aggressive organization representing interests of the West, which wanted to attack Russia through Ukraine. And at that point, there are 2 versions of this explanation. Either NATO actually attacked Russia through Ukraine, or NATO was actually preparing for an attack, but Russia managed to preempt it. So there are 2 versions of it. And that's perhaps the most important and consequential explanation emanating from Mr. Putin's regime itself. There's a secondary explanation, but you no longer hear it these days, and that was the Russian concern with the alleged genocide of Russians in the Donbas. Also, I have to say, last time a census was taken in Ukraine, the majority in the Donbas was actually Ukrainian. But it's okay. In the realm of explanations. So perhaps let me start with dealing with the most important reason mentioned by the Russian authorities. I understand why it resonates very well. It resonates very well because it is building on the previous Russian narratives, on the previous Soviet narratives of how the aggressive West was preparing to attack the country of socialism in order to suppress the most important political and social project of the 20th century. Note, too, that in the Soviet version, the aggressive plans, the alleged aggressive plans of NATO were always connected to Nazi past. Also, it was at times difficult to connect NATO to the Nazi past, but the Soviet ideologues tried real hard, and so do the Russian ideologues today. But here, however, a slight inconvenience presents itself. A slight inconvenience in the fact that Ukraine didn't really want to join NATO all that much. The notion of joining NATO was very much present in Ukraine, as it was in other former satellites and former republics of the Soviet Union. But it never was a majority opinion. In fact, it remained a minority opinion until the very moment when Mr. Putin attacked Ukraine. So the moment he attacked Ukraine, it became really important for the Ukrainian authorities to insert in the constitution the clause about aiming to join NATO. This is also the moment when, for the first time, there is popular support, the majority support in Ukraine for joining NATO. Why would that be? Well, you see, Ukraine also has Soviet legacy in the same way as Russia. And part of that Soviet legacy is, of course, suspecting the West of evil intentions, trying to smear the land of socialism, ideally to conquer some territories of the wonderful Soviet Union or Russia. And actually, some of these roots go even deeper into imperial past, when the official ideology of the Russian Empire emphasized an essential difference from any Western state or Western project, because the Russian Empire considered itself an ideological opponent of the West in the form of the only Orthodox Christian major power. So perhaps you have heard that Mr. Putin is continuing this line of argument. Also, some of us in North America, in particular, and in the UK, imagine him as a successor of the communist government and think that he will perhaps be the one who will help the cause of socialism. In reality, the official ideology of Putin's regime is ultra-conservative. They claim that they're the only truly Christian country on earth, which is why the closest allies of Russia are North Korea and used to be Venezuela until recently. Oh, and Iran as well. So you get where I'm heading. So that is the official explanation. Definitely no nostalgia for communism among the Russian officials. So if we are presented with a legacy like that, and I just made a very brief excursus into the history of the Russian legacy vis-a-vis the West, perhaps it's worth looking at the legacy of representing Ukraine. Because in this particular argument, I think, we'll find the most important actual reason for the Russian invasion. And it's an interesting legacy. Ukraine actually, historically, was a senior country in relation to Russia. In fact, the present-day territory of Moscow was once a frontier. The legacy is technically on the river Dnipro in what is now central Ukraine, which actually presents senior Russian officials with significant problems. They had to invent new archaeological sites that would be important for Russian heritage, because what they consider Russian heritage is, in fact, very much based in Kiev, Ukraine. The most famous knight in shining armor in Russian history is a fellow by the name of Ilya Muromets. So I've been noticing when taking Russian colleagues in long gone times to a major monastery in Kiev that they discovered with amazement that there is actually the grave of Ilya Muromets, and it is somehow in Kiev, which to them seemed, challenging. It actually suggested that Ukraine was historically really important. Now, if we look into the history, you would find that very soon after the incorporation of initial Ukrainian lands into the Russian Empire, the notion of Ukrainian treason develops. And this notion of Ukrainian treason is most prominently represented in the developments of 1708, 1709, when the Ukrainian Cossack leader Ivan Mazepa switched sides in the Great Northern War. And therefore, the official imperial representation was that whichever Ukrainian appears too patriotic, he or she must be the follower of Mazepa, which is why the empire called them Mazepists, the followers of the hetman. This practice continued through the 18th and 19th century, arriving into the early 20s, where the official theory of the empire was that the Ukrainian identity was in fact invented by the general staff of the Austrian army. And I am not kidding, that was the official version. However, the term Mazepists persisted, which I find quite interesting because it shows that this kind of vocabulary, this kind of characterization has very deep historical roots. So perhaps we need to pay attention to them. Interestingly enough, during the Russian Revolution, which is still called the Russian Revolution in most textbooks in North America, a new development took place. An independent republic was proclaimed in the Ukrainian lands. In fact, two republics were proclaimed, but I only have 45 minutes in this talk. So the leader of one of the republics was made by Soviet propaganda into an evil, impressive figure. The name was Simon Petlura. He wasn't really. But it so happened that once you create the image of the enemy, then everybody, and particularly patriotic Ukrainians who wished to speak Ukrainian, would be called Petlurites, no longer Mazepists. That language was present until the late 1940s. In 1944, we still have Stalin denouncing one famous Ukrainian filmmaker, Alexander Dovzhenko, telling him that he is a Petlurite. And this is really important because Petlura is long dead, obviously. And there is a new symbol of Ukrainian otherness, which is characterized as alienation. And that symbol is Stepan Bandera, the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And of course, as always is the case, there's a significant difference between the actual person and the image which remains in history. So starting in the late 1940s, whoever happens to be a patriotic writer writing in Ukrainian can easily be blamed for participation in the Bandera movement and called a Banderite. And what is interesting, Mr. Putin continues that same vocabulary. So there are Banderites, according to him, even today. And again, I only have 45 minutes. Otherwise, I would have gone into explaining how he arrives at the notion that there are Banderites today. So I think my point in this part of the lecture is that these are very deep historical archives. That's what it is. If you consider knowledge as an archive, this is a very deep one. And it also seems to be really important to Russian ideologues. So they can basically let some countries go, like Finland. But Ukraine cannot go because they are traitors. And there is a very specific term for the treasonous activities. Okay, then in what sense then? In one sense, it is important. Apparently, none of them participated in NATO exercises, right? Putin also claims, and publicly that was confirmed by his advisors, that his advisors in his political decisions are two, Tsar Peter I and Empress Catherine II. So I wonder what kind of advice they would give him on NATO, given that Peter adored Northern Europe and Catherine was a German princess. Right. I do teach Imperial Russia. by the way. And Catherine was very smart to emphasize that she actually organized a coup to capture the crown from her also German husband in the name of the Russian Orthodox Church. So maybe she could have done something about NATO, but definitely not Peter. Peter was probably more attuned to the division between Catholicism and Protestantism. He liked Protestant Northern Europe, if anything. But you see, if your vocabularies of classification go so deep, and if your historical advisors come from the 18th century, that indicates that the actual origins of the Russian thinking about Ukraine cannot possibly be in the existence of NATO. So, as well, in 2008, when the potential membership of Ukraine and the Republic of Georgia, not to be confused with a state, was considered at the meeting of NATO, the two major European powers actually vetoed it. That was not reported at the time, so I first heard about it from a retired Canadian ambassador to Ukraine who decided to retire to my university. And I have to say that we are second largest community of retired Canadian ambassadors where I live. All of them like the island. So he said that that was common knowledge in diplomatic circles, but that was not published at the time. That in 2008, Germany and France decisively vetoed any proposals about considering Ukraine a member of NATO. So if that goes so deep, then it must be a crucial characteristic of Russian identity, because it's not really about the state as such, but it is sort of about the role of Ukraine, which appears to be really important for Russia itself. So here, I need then to bring back our wonderful friends from political science, of whom great many in North America and the UK embrace the realist explanation of Mr. Putin's behavior in that, well, he does what everybody would do. I think your president says the same. Yeah, I understand Putin. That's what he does. Everybody would have done the same in his place. But that, of course, is very interesting in that it does not involve any deep historical explanations at all. That really refers to the logic of global international affairs in a sense that I would not allow a small country in the neighborhood to have a socialist government or something like that, or to have a patriotic nationalistic government. But that is totally divorced, it seems, from Mr. Putin's logic, right? So if it were a rational decision, then Mr. Putin would have acted very differently. I think it is a colossal mistake to see him through the light of this realist international theory, because that would involve counting the balances, the gains, and the potential difficulties, arriving at some decision, perhaps re-examining the balance every now and then, and eventually deciding perhaps against the initial course. And I remember even early on after Mr. Putin's invasion, some Western commentators, advisors to various governments, including your government, were saying that the really important thing is to provide an off-ramp to Mr. Putin. Because being a rational political actor, of course, after some fighting, whatever, maybe grabbing some part of Ukraine, he would be looking for an off-ramp. So we, understanding him fully, need to offer it to him. Somebody even mentioned that Mr. Putin must be interested in immunity after the end of the war. And therefore, we could negotiate his immunity in exchange for doing this or doing that. But of course, it is completely ridiculous to apply this kind of thinking to the person with whom Peter the Great and Catherine the Great are always in the same room. Like, really. He's not young. He's sick in more than one sense. He is a living person who identifies fully with the historical mission of Russia, which is understood a certain way. He is not afraid of death. He really cares about the way his legacy would be seen subsequently in the textbooks you write and read. Okay, so if this is then the motivation, then perhaps NATO does stand for something really important. But that would not be the military threat. NATO would perhaps, in Mr. Putin's language, would be about the threat of democracy. The West coming in to promote certain understanding of democracy. So the word democracy is always seen as problematic in post-Soviet Russia in one way or the other, especially after President Yeltsin. So more recently, the Russian authorities insisted on speaking of sovereign democracy. And you'll understand what it is if I also tell you that the currently Russian authorities are working on creating a sovereign internet. Right. So you see what sovereign democracy would be. Right, okay. So if NATO is a front organization of this whole Western drive to bring democracy to Russia, then it suddenly starts making sense in the present, not just in the past, because it fits with the direction of internal politics in Russia. The transformation which Russia and Ukraine underwent in the 1990s was to some degree similar, but beginning in 2000s, it was in fact the opposite. In Ukraine, perhaps chaotic and corrupt as it is, the presidents and prime ministers were changing all the time, whereas in Russia you would only have one great leader, Mr. Putin, and his sidekick, Dmitry Medvedev, who was allowed to serve briefly as president. In Ukraine, you would have an opposition in the parliament. In Russia, no, not really. And of course, it would be very difficult to blame NATO for making the Russian authorities murder oppositional journalists and politicians. So a lot of political leaders of the opposition in Russia were eliminated physically, perhaps the most prominent of them in front of the Kremlin, actually, crossing the bridge near the Kremlin, at which point it turns out that there are cameras all around the world in every building. But on that particular occasion, all of them were broken around the bridge, which of course gives you a signal. So you see, if it was not the NATO that made them dismiss murder, put in prison, try to poison with one poison, and finally poisoning with another poison, and I'm talking about Navalny here. If all of that was going on, then the NATO is involved in a way, because we would be talking about a choice of a liberal political order versus authoritarian political order. And in this war for hearts and minds, the West would be the opponent. And therefore, Russia needed to be protected. And it was protected with the elimination of any platform for opposition, physical removal and such, particularly after 2011 and 2012, when there were massive rallies in major Russian cities against Mr. Putin's plans to run for president forever. They were really concerned because these rallies looked very much like the Ukrainian Revolution of 2004, 2005. It was really after 2012 that Mr. Putin really started preparing the country for war. In retrospect, it is fairly clear. The economy was being transformed. Some of it was put on military footing already then. The Russian oligarchs were asked to repatriate the capitals from the West, to bring them back to Russia. At the last moments before the attack in 2012, the yacht owned by some Russian billionaires were suddenly removed from Western port facilities in order not to be captured by the Western authorities, which some of those yachts they still manage to capture. So there is then the actual fight about something really important in the present. The new generation, the politically active students, the urbanite youth, the professionals who showed up for the rallies and didn't want the president for life. And then Mr. Putin did what great many dictators did, and so did the Soviet Union. He externalized this threat by arguing that there can possibly, in Russia, you cannot possibly encounter a person who is not patriotic and supportive of Mr. Putin. So all these things must be coming from the West. And of course, some of them are coming through Ukraine. And what is worse is that Ukraine is an example of these things winning, of the two successful revolutions. Mr. Putin was really upset during the first revolution. Apparently, unconfirmed information, he urged the Ukrainian authorities to use power decisively against the protesters, which they didn't do for a variety of reasons, but this is a 45-minute lecture. And during the second revolution, he was already quite prepared by 2013, 2014 to do things. He grabbed the Crimea right away and tried to organize pro-Russian protests in some parts of the country, especially in the east. So at this point, I think I need to bring back the notion of the empire. There is lots of interesting research on what an imperial archive is like, on what the perception of the empire and colony are like. And this is not an easy comparison to make in the Ukrainian case, because things do match in the sphere of ideology, literature, and culture, and even politics. When Mr. Putin writes a historical article about the unity of Russia and Ukraine, these things all click. However, it is problematic to argue that Ukraine was, in fact, an economic colony exploited by the Soviet Union. It was in some periods, but not always or clearly in the other periods. So the subtlety is called for when examining this particular part of imperial archive. And the subtlety in the Ukrainian case must be a look deeper into the Russian identity. Because you can imagine, and my colleagues here, especially some other former republics of the Soviet Union, in some of them, perhaps, the colonial attitudes were better defined, even in terms of, let's say, the army, the imperial Tsarist army stationed in the region, becoming the source of revolution, while at the same time remaining really the armed forces of the colonizer. So there are all kinds of very interesting ambiguities here, but none of them is more powerful than the ambiguity with Ukraine. And that was that the Tsarist government denied the existence of the Ukrainian people, claimed that they, together with the neighboring Belarusians, constituted the united Russian nation, the three-unite nation consisting of three different parts. One of them, by far the greatest, the Russians, Ukrainians second. But of course, the Russians, no matter how great, really needed Ukrainians to be counted in order to constitute a majority in the Russian Empire. Without Ukraine, Russians would not constitute a majority. And in the Soviet Union, too, in great many ways, it was important to incorporate Ukrainians into the project of running the empire, even so some of them, in fact, refused to be part of it. So here we do encounter one situation which is quite typical, and namely that you are accepted as a member of the imperial elites until the moment when you say that, but there are also the rights of my nation or group, for our culture, for our religion. And that is the moment when you are no longer the member of the elites. And the situation could be described as being a bit like Ireland to England, or a bit like Scotland to England. But then the moment comes when you realize that, wow, so the empire is relatively modern in the Russian case. It's also an interesting empire. So, and I'm sure there are colleagues on campus who can give you wonderful lectures about the nature of the Russian Empire and how it differed from other European ones. But the thing is that that particular understanding that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians constitute the same historical group, united by the Orthodox religion, Eastern version of Christianity, and also by the languages that are mutually comprehensible to a significant degree. But then again, Polish is quite comprehensible to Ukrainians. Slovak language is quite comprehensible to Russians. So there are all kinds of historical connections here and there. But the point is, it goes beyond the notion of the empire. It actually challenges the notion of who Russians are. Not just what Russia is as a state, which never really processed the loss of the empire as such, but also the notion of who the Russians are. And these two things are connected because you can argue that Russia never received a true chance to develop the notion of its national interests as opposed to imperial interests of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire never fully switched to the notion of ethnic Russians being the foundation of the empire. Instead, it went with the version of the Orthodox Christians being, by definition, the supporters of the empire, and the minorities would need to support the rule of His or Her Majesty, but they wouldn't need to be assimilated, and that's an interesting part. really. And of course, the Russian Empire never assimilated Ukrainians, nor did it attempt to assimilate Ukrainians. Instead, the empire tried to limit the access of Ukrainian patriotic intelligentsia to the peasants. So the Tsarist government assumed that the Ukrainian peasants are Russians by definition. You just do not need to allow any quote-unquote nationalists access to them. And that, of course, means that the notion, very dear to the heart of Mr. Putin, that Ukraine is artificial, not the fully fledged state or nation, was already present in the ideology of the Muscovite Tsars. And one embarrassing moment in Ukrainian history is that it was the Ukrainian intellectuals who helped the Russian Tsardom to develop the notion that they are the descendants of the Rus state, that the defining feature is Orthodox religion, that there will be a continuity built in the development of the Russian Empire. All of these notions actually introduced by Ukrainian intellectuals, most of them monks, trying to defend the interests of the church, trying to defend the interests of the monastery and such. Okay, so if the falseness of Ukraine is introduced even before the Russian Empire is formed, and the Russian Empire actually acquires some territories which are distinct societies. Like in Canada, Quebec is a distinct society which calls itself a nation. So my students understand quite well the ethnic meaning of the nation. So Kazan is conquered in 1552, and it is still very visible. The presence of mosques and the language and culture is still very notable after more than 500 years. So if this particular perception that Ukraine is false, constructed by somebody, goes back that far, we would need then to prove, because it's easy to say, well, all the Russians, they are just basically nasty. They don't want to recognize the Ukrainian identity. But a historian would, of course, need to harness some arguments for that. And the arguments would have to involve demonstrating that under Lenin and Stalin, this notion was not sufficiently deconstructed. Now, for that, I would need an hour and a half. Okay, so I will skip right away to Khrushchev, who in 1954 actually organizes a transfer of the Crimean Peninsula from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian Republic, which, according to Mr. Putin's ideology, is a grand betrayal. And of course, that was the reason why he sought to reclaim the Crimea, which he did. But actually, the Crimea happens to be a classic example of the imperial settler society, in which the majority of the Russian population is second or third generation. So the grandparents would tell them when they came in 1944-45, they took over somebody's houses, somebody's land, somebody's vineyards, the best choice land by the sea. And that settler society was moreover mobilized during the early 1990s by the threat that the native, the aboriginal, is coming back, which is the reason why in the Crimean political mobilization, Russians and Ukrainians organized together, which you would not expect elsewhere in the country. But it did happen in the Crimea because they were both representatives of the Soviet settlers. Because after the Crimean Tatars were all deported during 3 nights in May 1944, then settlers were invited who could be ethnic Russians, ideally, but also some Ukrainians. And because they are in a similar economic situation, they don't want to give up the land, the houses, the vineyards, because the return of the native represents a very classic and recognizable post-imperial dilemma. For that reason, in the early 1990s, the Crimean society mobilizes completely Ukrainians mobilizing as Russians as well. That's quite stunning, right? So there is more on the Crimea, but that's the point which I try to make when I'm running out of time. I'm running out of time. So what then the explanation of the war in terms of the inner logic of the development of Russia as a nation and an empire? So clearly, there is a domestic constituent here, namely the danger represented to Mr. Putin's regime by the events of 2011-2012. It is the period when he starts eliminating the last vestiges of oppositional platforms in Russia, such as the Museum of the Gulag, the Solzhenitsyn Foundation, So plenty of them still left. And also politicians start dying under suspicious circumstances. Journalists are being killed under suspicious circumstances. But also, interestingly enough, the Russian justifications of the war become increasingly historical. And this is the moment when Mr. Putin, in personal audiences with Western leaders, spends most of his time not on the genocide of Russians in the Donbas, which was fake to start with, but actually on long history lectures, which are somewhat annoying to other foreign leaders. The Europeans tended to politely listen. And then your president apparently expressed it very loudly in that he didn't want to listen for long history lectures, which I don't think was an indication of his support for Ukraine, but rather general dislike of longer and complex historical discourses. Yeah. Right. So here we go. All right. So, and then you see, Ukraine then is a challenge to all the important components of Mr. Putin's Russia. It is the land of successful revolutions, which he wants to describe in the language of extreme nationalism. They are the Nazis. They are the anti-Semites. They are this, they are that. And of course, the inconvenience here is that the most recent Ukrainian revolution of 2013 was started with a Facebook post by a journalist whose name was Mustafa Nayyem, who actually was a child refugee from Afghanistan who grew up in Ukraine and didn't even speak Ukrainian at the moment the post was in Russian. So clearly there was no genocide at this point. But also the kind of society which can elect a Jewish president and in which a revolution can be started by an Afghani journalist who was, by the way, racially profiled by Ukrainian police in the past. Like he didn't look sufficiently Ukrainian. The Ukrainian police is a little bit this way. Yeah. So the names of Nayyem and Zelensky, people who are clearly not ethnic Ukrainians and obviously not Nazis, make it very difficult for Mr. Putin to actually discuss what is going on in Ukraine without bringing the familiar rhetorical device of Ukraine being run from the outside by the West, primarily by the United States, until the most recent presidential election in your country, right? Which changed everything. So it is then a challenge in terms of a mobilized society, which imagines itself politically as a civil community in which you don't have to be an ethnic Ukrainian, but you need to respect the rights of the language and culture precisely because the empires went against them on a major crusade for centuries. Then it is also the country in which the society is mobilized to an enormous degree. As you probably know, this winter has been very difficult for Ukrainians because the Russian government decided specifically to focus on a well-known war crime of destroying civilian infrastructure, specifically for power, heat, and water, hoping to terrorize the big cities into submission. That has been tried before. London in 1940 somehow did not submit to Adolf Hitler. And this is not going to happen in Ukraine either. But what it means is that we suddenly walk into the existential crisis for Mr. Putin. So if he started the war claiming that Ukrainians are Russians, and now he's actually killing Ukrainian civilians, it means that something changed in his motivation, which he has not expressed politically. So my theory would be that he was never concerned about saving the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. He never cared about the population of Donbas, let alone Crimea. There are always political pawns in the same way as ethnic Germans in some European countries were for Hitler. What he really felt necessary was, in fact, to restore the Russian greatness by going back to the most important imperial conquests. And the most important conquest was actually Ukraine, not because it was a rich land, and not because it was some kind of exotic society, but rather because it was the closest. So in order to somehow undo the epistemic or epistemological language involved in this war, Ukrainians or Russians. Ukraine was always historically Russia. The West is responsible for everything. The only solution is, in fact, to transition straight to the killing and attacking the civilian population. And that is very telling. Mr. Putin does not abandon his historical agenda. Catherine and Peter are still in the same room with him. That's his thinking. He doesn't care about how many years he will rule. He cares about all these great imperial conquests that will be, he thinks, in future historical textbooks. But at the same time, he is, in fact, for himself, implicitly, perhaps at night, acknowledged that Ukrainians are not going to surrender because they were never Russians in the first place, as modern nations were formed. In fact, it can be argued that Russians were Ukrainians in the past. So because I still have 1.5 minutes, that was clear early on in the war. But in fact, not too many historians jumped on this opportunity to explain historical politics to Russians and to Mr. Putin, perhaps. Because you see, he thought that it would be very easy to defend Ukraine in 3 days. And a number of prominent American commentators, as well as Canadian ones, some of these commentators are now actually on the 4th anniversary of the war, are given interviews in Ukraine saying, I always believed, blah, blah, blah. And then the journalist says, but you said it will take 3 days for Russia to call. Well, I was mistaken, but let me explain to you this one, though. Because there was also a proliferation of overnight experts on Ukraine, not knowing the languages of the region, not really knowing histories of the region, just, sounding like experts. Yeah, and by the way, in present-day Ukrainian, the term expert is an offensive term. Really, yeah, because the population is so fed up with people being represented as experts on something. So if you call somebody an expert, that's actually a disparaging term. Like, this person is not very knowledgeable, but just looks good on TV and, and prognosticates well and whatever. So, yeah. So what, of course, and that was already the first signal which we should have immediately interpreted and very prominently, because they thought they would take Ukraine in 3 days, because the Ukrainians who speak Russian would bring flowers to Russian tanks, because it would happen immediately, because you see, the Americans are only running the country through Zelensky, but the ordinary Ukrainians, they're truly Russians. They want to join Russia. And here he is in a familiar dilemma of all dictators, because the subordinates are only delivering to him the intel he is going to like. And of course, the Russian army was completely unprepared for the actual war that went on, but also this insistence by Putin that Ukrainians are not a real nation, let alone political nation, which can include Russians, Jews, Afghans, whoever. So that insistence already indicated that historically, no matter how much time it's going to take, we are dealing with a regime which is backward-facing, thinking back to the world of ethnic nations, racial politics. Like, Putin would really feel good in the 1930s, I think. Yeah, 1930s, 1940s would be his time. Of course, the 1840s he would also like, I'm sure. With a forward-looking society which embraces a political community or a civic community, right? So historically, Putin is bound to lose. We just don't know how much time it would take and how many casualties and how much destruction Ukraine is going to accumulate in the process. And I'm right on time. Thank you so much.
We have time for questions, comments, discussion.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your informative and very educational lecture. Where is Ukraine right now? What's going to happen in your professional judgment in the end?
One thing for sure, Zelensky is a really shrewd politician. And he functions like a really modern 21st century politician. He's a showman, but with a clear understanding of the harsh political decisions that are involved. So he dismisses his prime ministers quite often and reshuffles his cabinet. I know in the UK, they also do it, and we in Canada do it as well. But he clearly understands the notion of responsibility. He wants to protect his reputation, and yet his approval is fairly low. That is because his inner circle consists of his personal friends from the entertainment industry, whom he appointed to various positions for which they never qualified, but because he knew them. And the result of that was the corruption not really being fought properly. In fact, last year in July, I think, the Ukrainian youth, like high school children and university students, showed up for yet another revolution with handmade posters against the decision taken by Zelensky. That was reported in the West, but I don't think it actually registered. The significance of that registered with the experts. And the significance was that, quite simply, the people are going to hold him accountable after the war ends. So he is going to end up, I think, like Churchill, being defeated in the election at the very end of the war. For that reason, he and the Ukrainian elites are interested in a very strange proposal, which was originally Russian, but endorsed by the Biden administration, that Ukraine somehow needs to have the elections. That otherwise, the Ukrainian government is illegitimate, the president is illegitimate, even though the constitution forbids elections during wartime. And of course, this is a distant echo of the same vocabulary of Ukraine being artificial. So I'm telling you, like the Russian foreign minister would say, if you just give them a chance for free elections, the true Russian nature of Ukrainians would come out. That's not going to happen. But Zelensky probably is going to suffer political consequences fairly soon, for which reason his closest circle is actually considering this very strange Russo-American proposal, also bipartisan on the American side, which is even more amazing, as a potential saving grace. Because if Ukraine holds elections during the war, he would have a high chance of winning. But anyway, even after the war, there is no chance on earth that a pro-Russian candidate would win. It could be a general. I don't really like the scenarios in which generals, also Eisenhower, and yeah, there are good cases and not so good cases. But it's going to be a patriotic Ukrainian candidate because Putin, in the process of doing what I've described, accomplished the unthinkable. He completely broke the ties between the Russians and Ukrainians. Like lots of families are not talking to each other, separated by the border. So Ukraine is going to survive for sure. There is a young generation which protested the decision to take some prerogatives from the special anti-corruption office created through the pressure by Western allies and such. So they are watching, and what is even more amazing is that high school students and like first and second year university students are watching for this. They don't want to live after the war in the country where anti-corruption drive is going to be, stopped in some way. So that's what is going to happen. Ukraine is not anywhere near collapsing. I already told some colleagues yesterday at lunch that in residential buildings in Ukraine, it is now common to have a group online. Usually on Viber, which is not very popular here, but it's a very Eastern European and Chinese thing, social media. So people join the same group by the building so that they can help each other, where they offered, recently there was a drive in the group in which my spouses and my daughter are subscribed. People were saving the ducks from the pond because the pond was freezing. So they organized to save the ducks. They organized to look after the disabled and elderly. And actually, the irony is then the Russian rocket plunged into that very lake where they're saving the ducks, but they did manage to save the ducks. So that, for me, is a powerful indication, together with, teenagers showing up with sometimes unquotable posters involving obscenities, saying, I don't want to live in a country like that, really, after the war. So tough to say whether Putin realizes that. I think he does, which is precisely the reason why he is destroying Ukraine. as it is. There will be an enormous landscape of ruins, lots of ruined lives, the nature of warfare, on which I'm, in fact, lecturing occasionally. I would love to spend 2 hours talking about the nature of warfare. But in short, it is such that the number of people with amputated limbs is unprecedented. In World War I, it was quite high as well. In World War II, not necessarily so. But in this one, enormously difficult. Evacuating any wounded from the line of contact is next to impossible. So there will be the entire generation of people requiring prosthetic surgeries and equipment, men and women. And so now is actually a drive to make it more acceptable in society. So they're printing calendars with the women showing the prosthetic limbs. There is the brother of Mustafa Nayem, a lawyer who lost an eye at the front. He refuses to wear a patch over his eye so that it is in everyone's view and so that the society becomes more acceptable. It becomes more acceptable and embracing and healing, hopefully, as well. This a transformation of the warfare is quite fantastic and ongoing, as a matter of fact. Sorry, I took too much time. Yes, please.
The mantra which he repeated last night, if he had been president, this war would not have happened. I've never heard an explanation as to why that would be true. I don't know if you can shed light on what the thinking is there.
He fully believes Mr. Putin. He, in fact, repeats explanations from the Russian media that are spoon-fed to him by Russian negotiators, who are also very skilled in proposing various joint ventures after the war is over, from which individual figures close to the administration might benefit. Ukraine is also trying to join in this game. The largest lithium mine in Ukraine was apparently recently assigned to an American company run by a person who is a close friend of your president. So it's a strange mixture of the openly self-interested economic moves and the rejection of the real problem that the aggressor was Russia. In fact, it is very telling that Mr. Trump keeps repeating that Zelensky should never have started this war, but he didn't. And that Zelensky only has 4% popularity. Lots of my colleagues were digging, where is this 4% is coming from? Finally found it in one video by a Russian propagandist. Like very, very difficult to find. But apparently the Russian side prepares briefs for Mr. Trump to hand to him and to his collaborators. Europe is holding strong. So does Canada. Also, our army is small and the economic ability to support is small. So does the United Kingdom, France as well. So I cannot imagine the war ending, even if the United States completely withdraw, as they have already, I think, economically, by asking the European partners to purchase the arms in the US in order to be given to Ukraine. The war is not going to end. And the reason for that is actually, funnily, I don't see it in American media at all. The experts have completely lost it. So if you follow this logic, then for the Russian identity, it is really important to be seen negotiating with the Americans directly. For that reason, the Russian side loves the opportunities of this red carpet in Anchorage and such. So it is really important for them to negotiate because at that moment, Putin appears to be in the company of Catherine the Great and Peter I. He is respected by the West. Now, it is completely irrelevant whether these negotiations actually lead to something. In fact, they better not for the Russian interests, because if you can get away with the war, if the West is split, some of my colleagues argue that splitting the West was, in fact, the original purpose of attacking Ukraine. If so, it has been achieved. So there is a lot here, but that's a good question. On this side, yes, please.
You spoke about a couple of things in terms of 2014 and the Revolution of Dignity. Were the people that were advising Putin, or is Putin blind enough that he didn't see that the revolution in 2013, 2014 was actually bringing together Ukrainian culture and beginning to bind all the various groups within Ukraine into one country, one nation. Since 2014, we've seen a coming together and a creation of that nation, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of religion, regardless of what your roots are, looking at a Ukraine that is a Ukrainian Jew, a Ukrainian Muslim. But we see those roots coming together on the Maidan in 2014. Was he blind, or was he simply thinking that that can be destroyed?
He was blind, I think. I would argue that the roots of these identities actually go back to the previous revolution of 2004, 2005. It is incidentally in my textbook of Ukrainian history as well. So some colleagues have noticed already then actually could arguably go to 2001, 2002 even. But you are right in that the most recent revolution consolidated it. But of course, the war itself is an even more powerful consolidating factor. I do believe that Putin was receiving the intel he liked. He also has a friend who is a Ukrainian oligarch who has been exchanged for whatever hundreds of POWs in an exchange, whose children Putin helped baptize. And there's this wonderful term which I don't think exists in English to describe the person who was present as a godfather and godmother at the baptism of your children. So how would you call it? Like cum? What is the English equivalent? The godfather of my children or something. So there is this fellow who probably is feeding Mr. Putin the exact same propaganda. The only moment when you do get a sense that there was some understanding of Ukrainian realities was in that they probably never tried to conquer Western Ukraine in the original plans or even in the plans as they exist now, realizing that this is the most patriotic part of the country, which is most pro-Western and the highest percentage of Ukrainian speakers and such, but also because it fits beautifully with the notion of long historical vocabulary. Tsar Nicholas II was advised, if you want to destroy Russia, incorporate Galicia into it. Stalin notoriously was facing the resistance of nationalist guerrillas. So that too fits with this long logic of identity and historical thinking. So he probably accepted that Galicia is beyond our reach. But as I said, the decision on bombarding civilian infrastructure, specifically targeting water, electricity, and heat, could not have been taken without Mr. Putin's endorsement. So his endorsement for that indicates the awareness that the cities are not going to be spared. And that means it's very difficult to make an argument that Ukraine will be reunited with Russia by means of destroying the cities. Like the last person who proposed that was Adolf Hitler, very famously. He refused to go into any major Ukrainian city, never held a victory parade in the capital of Kiev, because he said the big cities are going to be completely leveled, because this is going to be the German agricultural settlement area, and we need to kill millions of these people. And in the end, as it comes out at Nuremberg, there will be 30 million locals who also will have to be somehow disposed of. So this kind of logic clearly reflects at least his inner decision that they are separate. So ironically, right, the most glaring war crime indicates a shift in the Russian understanding of historical Russian and Ukrainian identity. So I think he is getting some signals. Yeah, sorry. So, Markian, please.
So, clear thought. We still need to think about the historical roots of this conflict. You don't do often enough. But I wanted to ask you, if you have a sense of why observers in the West have such trouble thinking in complex ways about the historical roots, right? When you position your talk as being a critique in some ways of fake expertise, but I'm afraid. So how would Why do you think this is, and is there something that might be done about it?
Yeah, it happened in historical research before. So at some point in the mid 20th century, the 50s and 60s, it was perfectly okay to imagine that the people living in the Soviet Union are just like us. They're really interested in a new house, large car, investing, making some money, maybe speculating some property. So it took considerable research with displaced populations to figure out at which point the US Air Force intelligence was running a large project of talking to Soviet citizens abroad and such. But also, I think the profession was having trouble to formulate it in such way that they are different. There was a long telegram by Keenan, but it was a Cold War statement which did not really land well, I think, in the academia. But then there was a debate in the 90s already about Soviet subjectivity, whether it existed, and as you probably know better than I do because of your research. So whether the Soviet people were fundamentally different, indoctrinated, and they had different understanding of the world and different desires. I think the answer to that was provided by history very effectively with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, but still people publish some really interesting research on that. So essentially, yes, it is true of some periods, especially of urban use, but the majority of the population was probably never indoctrinated, and they were waiting for the moment. Some of them living in certain regions also had national allegiance as more important than socialist allegiance. That is not a judgment on my part. But coming to terms with the misinterpretation of the Soviet experience, okay, so I said Russia never came to terms with its own imperial past, but in a way, the profession, particularly in political science and kind of daily analysis in the press, never really came to terms with its own image of the Soviet Union as a mirror image of the United States. They must be like us. So they would not tolerate, a small country in the region. They would want to have some economic exploitation. They would want to regulate certain things and culture, whatever. And that, I believe, remains the foundation of all this analysis, which I read and then I find it slightly upsetting. Actually, I start my morning by reading the Russian press on the internet, so it's difficult to get more upsetting than that. And by the way, yesterday, there was a survey, an anonymized survey of Russian prisoners of war currently held by Ukraine. So in an anonymized survey, 68% said that the war is just and it's a great thing. So it's not Mr. Putin's war. It really is related to some things that they hold fundamental for themselves. Now, the American political scientists, I went to a number of conferences with people working for some think tank, and in some cases I would just really, so you have zero understanding, right? And you don't know the area, nor the languages for that matter. But this kind of an arrogance. We run the world. I remember at one conference, an American political, the think tank person who constantly smiled and said, oh, I know really important people in Washington. So we could throw Ukraine under the bus or to the wolves. And then somebody from the audience said, but you can't really afford to do that. So you're just basically celebrating the arrogance of the great power, and you're enjoying yourself in the process. Say, we could have done this, then we've done that. But basically, if it is based on rational logic, that would not be the case. But so that, I think, what really is in the center of it, which is most obvious and most scandalous, is a simple fact that the Ukrainian agency doesn't matter at all. It's all about us and them, so we can solve it. And that episode just before the invasion in 2022, when Blinken is meeting with Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. So they talked about everything, and of course Lavrov said, oh, no, of course we are not going to attack. It's your capitalist falsification or whatever, great power falsification. And at the end, Blinken reportedly says, so Sergei, using the first name for Lavrov, which of course makes me think of a historian as saying, Oh, Adolf, so what is the problem? Actually, he said, so what is the problem with NATO or something? Maybe we can solve it. And the Russian foreign minister walks out without answering. But of course, him walking out is the answer. But the kind of naive, incredibly naive question by Blinken, not it's just on top of calling the Russian colleague by the first name, whereas he should really be tried by special tribunal. But yeah. Yeah. So that's what it is, because what is totally lost is the agency of the Ukrainian people. It doesn't matter, because deep in their hearts, some people in realist school believe that the Ukrainian people have no agency. It really only us and the Russians and the Chinese who have the agency. The rest of the world, we could negotiate. So, and I find it difficult that in the 21st century you can do that. Yeah. You're watching time, right? Okay. Yes, please.
Fine. Purely hypothetical question that has been running in my mind for many years. If in 1990, the Russian Orthodox Church in Donbas decided to make a to seize the Russian Orthodox Church, where would we be today?
I
Fire operation. Seize.
I really need 2 hours for that. Just to tell you, I'm having arguments with my son-in-law on this very topic that last for 2 hours. But basically, the church was completely subordinated by the Soviet regime. It was obedient. It never charted a separate course, separate from the interests of the regime. It would have been probably damaging to the national pride as cultivated by the Yeltsin government to do that. Most bishops were secret agents of KGB or not so secret agents or whatever. In fact, the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, including in this country, rejected the legitimacy of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia because it was guilty of the sin of, I think it's called simony, but also in this particular case, Sergianism, because of the name of Patriarch Sergius, who accepted his power from Stalin in person and essentially led this movement to adjust the church as an instrument of state. So it didn't have agency at this moment, unfortunately. Doing so would also acknowledge the superiority of Ukraine. And, you know, Yeltsin looked really good on television. There was, yeah, I think I used it in one article. There were 4 days in August 1991. I was a graduate student, actually, doing my master's. There were 4 days in August 1991 when it seems like there will be a democratic and free Russia. And maybe Ukraine can live peacefully with a democratic and free Russia, because Yeltsin's logic was that the Soviet Union was an evil empire. I know he did not invent the term, but basically that's his representation. So we need to separate from the empire so that the future Russia becomes prosperous, because it no longer needs to support all these other republics, which was, of course, also a myth that it had been supporting the republics. So Yeltsin sounded really good. Actually, he sounded so good that on his visit to Kiev in the summer of 1991, people showed up on the posters, Yeltsin is great, Kravchuk is bad, so he's the Ukrainian leader of the time, who was seen as trying to preserve the authority of the nomenclature. But then, after 4 days, Yeltsin's press secretary issued a very strange statement, saying that the post-Soviet countries, which did not conduct negotiations with Russia about separating from the Soviet Union and did not sign comprehensive friendship treaty with Russia, could be subject to Russian territorial claims. So on day 4, some of us started already celebrating democratic Russia, la la, and here he comes. And of course, it was all blamed on the poor press secretary. But everybody understood that it was coming straight from Yeltsin himself. He took little advice on foreign policy, as a matter of fact. And everybody understood that the main focus of this comment were Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Lo and behold, they remain the main focus for the Russian authorities up to the present. Perhaps some of you who watching Kazakhstan closely, which all of us should be, because that's the country where the interests of China and Russia are clashing. And that is a very interesting clash for an informed analyst of foreign affairs, not those people from the tanks in DC. So, yeah, there was a wonderful dream. It lasted for 4 days. Yeah, and it only went from there, it went just already by 1996, 97, the Ukrainian authorities realized that you need to blackmail Russians by also developing relations with the West, or else they would become really openly aggressive. Then the Crimean issue explodes in 1994, which Yeltsin actually refuses to exploit. Crimea is such an interesting story. It's like a recent settler society, Yeltsin's opening for grabbing Crimea, but deciding against it for complex reasons and such. So there is a lot. I loved your question. It would really have been nice, for them to acknowledge. Because one metropolitan of Kiev was considered as a close candidate for the election, the metropolitan of Moscow, and he said something like, it is more valuable to be the 218th metropolitan of Kiev than the 57th patriarch of Moscow, which we said, yeah, if you are serious about your religion, right. Anyway, sorry, I'm taking too much time.
This was terrific. Thanks so much for really interesting talk and for coming to campus. I'm wondering about a claim that both legitimate experts and these other experts that you've mentioned talk about, which is that what's happening in Ukraine and how things end up in Ukraine will fundamentally alter the world order as we know it. And I'm wondering if you could address that claim. How legitimate is it, and what does that mean when they say that?
I think what is happening right now is very clearly the damage to American relations with Europe is probably irreparable, whoever is the next president. I think the precedent has been created, and Europe is going to build itself into a separate military force, and more than one country is now talking about acquiring nuclear weapons. So that would actually geopolitically be quite a bit of a realignment. Now, the precedent of Ukraine being able to fight off the Russian forces successfully for 4 years is in itself probably going to create a separate special position for Ukraine in the future. It probably is going to have a largest army in Europe into a very, very distant future. And of course, last week it was reported that German army has invited Ukrainian instructors for the training of German soldiers, because it's a new kind of war in which it's better to learn by example of how you kind of guide your drones and what do you do in this situation and that situation. The West is behind on that. Also, I wonder what it makes for the notion of popular sovereignty and the acknowledgement that some things can happen and they are not organized by the Americans or the Russians, for that matter, so that the people have agency. I think the analysis is now a ridiculous application of skills and knowledge, because we now deal with a rather unique combination of the Russian president being an authoritarian ruler who imagines world in a certain way. Like, remember Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, said, and that was leaked to the press, that he lives in his own world in which history is alive at the moment. You could step into this river and then you continue the conquest of Catherine the Great or something. And of course, another person who was supposed to be the leader of the free world is also that kind of person who can change opinions easily, has strong views and not necessarily influenced by the memos, even the best written memos. So there is an element of predictability. So much of the commentary on when the war is going to end, it's just complete, running your imagination free. That's what it is at this point. And the future of the world is probably going to involve a significant realignment. That was noticed by the commentators, and on that I congratulate them. It is difficult to notice if you make a trip to London, right? Or Berlin, and suddenly do not see things this way. I know lots of my colleagues, both in Canada and in the United States, actually discovered that if you go to the BBC website, you end up on the landing page for North America, which has a much better coverage of North American developments than some of our media in this country and even in Canada. So really cool. People are coming back to BBC, which I sort of temporarily as what is it, imperial instinct or something. Except Europe is also very different. Right. So there is a realignment happening right now, in which I think the greatest difficulty exists in both these two characters who are unpredictable, but also in the undecision on whether China is prepared to act decisively. There was a moment when the Chinese government issued a statement that it would not allow the defeat of Russia. And that seemed to everybody the wow moment, like, oh, okay, so what are they going to do? Join the war, supply lots of weapons and such. But they're probably not in a position to do that, actually, as of now. But then they withdrew. And so if this is true, that the realignment would have to take place between among, because there's more than two now, right? Europe, which is sort of united with some exceptions, the United States and Russia, then I would argue for Ukraine becoming an important actor, which would please me as a historian and would probably good for the societies in all of the countries involved. But I'm kind of really reluctant to prognosticate. Yeah, because the tariffs are on, the tariffs are off, the tariffs are coming back. We don't want the cars from Canada. No, but we want, because I was told that there is an agreement. So only with the parts made within this agreement. And then, of course, Canada switches to allowing the Chinese car into the country, electric cars. And if you asked an expert 6 months ago, they would probably say, that's impossible. That will never happen, like ever. And then the Canadian government is increasing the military budget by the factor of 5 or something. If asked 2 years ago, I would say never, because the Canadian defense and the Canadian emergency preparedness is all based on the Americans coming in. In fact, I live in the earthquake-prone area in which the main planning device is the presence of American army, which will come from Seattle to save us in a case of major earthquake. Yeah. And one of my former students is actually an officer serving on the island, and he said secretly that Canada actually has only 4 guns in our area, and not all 4 of them are functioning. So this is going to change. This is going to change. It's interesting, but I think it would be irresponsible for us to predict how it plays along. But you, the young people in the room, will see it. You know this famous thing, which I always use in my courses, Lenin given a guest lecture with Swiss students in 1917, telling them, my generation will never live to see the revolution, but perhaps you, the younger generation, will. In only a few months, he was already back in Russia with German support and emerging as a leader. So here we are, one of the shrewdest politicians of the time, completely ignorant of what the next few months will bring. And I gladly join the club of people who are reluctant to commit to a prediction. Hey. Professor Weidlinger, please.
About the regional variation in Ukraine right now, the extent to which you think the pre-war regional political variation still exists, the extent to which you think that regional variation would be manifested in support for Zelensky right now, or for support for continuing the war the way it's going. So you can comment on that.
That's a very difficult question, because first of all, there is a considerable 20% of occupied territory where there was a population change that nobody was tracing. There are people who are dislocated, displaced from those territories, and we cannot predict whether they will ever come back. And apparently the population on these territories is also changing. Apparently lots of Russians are buying apartments in Mariupol, which was almost completely destroyed. And there are all kinds of sweet deals there. And Russian realtors are saying the best thing is to buy the ruins. That's in the language of real estate. The ruins is actually an apartment, the owners of which left for Ukraine. So there will be tons of things to sort out. I think the support for the war is pretty equal across the Ukrainian territory. What Putin also did with his war, he destroyed forever the possibility of a pro-Russian political party in Ukraine playing a major role, in part because he grabbed the Crimea and part of the Donbas, including the two biggest cities. So he basically crushed that. He also crushed the NATO agenda by Sweden and Finland joining the NATO. So this whole thing is basically crushing on him. And he, to some degree, I think, is accepting the way Hitler did by December 1941, that this thing is not going well, so let's start exterminating the people we want to exterminate. The population there's going to be regional diversity for sure after the war, I'm sure. Right now, it's not visible. The population opinion surveys that are anonymized are showing fairly high degree of unanimity in supporting independent Ukraine going forward. There is, I just read yesterday, there is actually one point on which there is no clear agreement, and that is holding a referendum, which Zelensky thought would be his political device to salvage his candidacy at the next elections. So if it is combined with a referendum, then it is not him who gives up the territories to Putin, but it is actually the people of Ukraine. But the people of Ukraine are split on that issue. But that's actually the only issue on which they are split. Because on the issue of giving up territories, as measured for a few years, it's pretty stable that they don't want to do that. So it will be politically a suicide for Zelensky, and he is looking for the ways of going around it. My prediction is that maybe he will end up like Gorbachev at some point, touring the West as a superstar, and myself and my colleagues writing books about him. Yeah, Gorbachev actually charged $250,000 US per visit. Yeah. Yeah, he made it even to small American universities in the middle of nowhere, I'm being told, as long as they were able to fit the bill. So Zelensky is going to keep his star power in the West for sure, not so much in Ukraine, because really his friends proved to be incompetent, corrupt bunch, which is embarrassing for the country. And this is going to be a wild card in the future of anti-Semitism as well. Because on social media, I think I'm noticing more statements like Zelensky and his Jewish fellows. And of course, I have to acknowledge that some of them had done the runner already, and they are in Israel, right? So, and they could not be arrested on all these corruption charges because they're there. So that could become a factor again, which is not at all during the war, but it might. There will be, I think, a new government, a new president, and I hope the Western countries will resume the kind of power they had before the war, when you realize that there's a corrupt bunch there. So all the ambassadors of the Big Seven show up in the guest box in the parliament to observe the voting. And so everybody knows that if you allow your party faction to run free, of course they would only vote for things that exempt them from anything, or no declaration, no electronic declaration of the money I stole, whatever, and such. But the ambassadors of the West, they do enjoy quite a bit of power in Ukraine, and lots of Ukrainians like it. I have to mention that the Canadian ambassador is my classmate from the University of Alberta. Yeah, a bright woman who I'm happy to see on social media is making the difference. Yeah, so the end of the war is quite unpredictable. I would expect some regional variation, but definitely not around the issue of Ukrainian independence. Lots of people are itching to get started with the contracts of rebuilding Ukraine, realizing how many billions will be and maybe trillions involved into that. And of course, some American companies are positioning themselves. In the process, of course, this was the deal about the Ukrainian mineral wells, which was so embarrassing that the Ukrainian authorities in the end did not present it to the public. So they only run through the parliament the framework agreement that the United States would be able to supervise the fund into which the profits from Ukrainian minerals would go, and that the American companies would have the first place in claiming new mineral, whatever, exploration. The full agreement was not released, so we don't quite know. It came up in the media incidentally about the largest lithium mine that the American company was bidding on it. And of course, Ukraine is still the kind of place where supposedly you have electronic reporting on everything, and yet somehow it happens that only one company entered its bid and all others were disqualified. And that is the company which was created, and it's actually a real example, by a cook from Slovakia, by the Ukrainian woman who is displaced to Europe and works as a cook in a small Slovakian town. And of course, lots of us thought back right away to Lenin's famous prediction that in our great future country, even the cook woman will run the state. And that, of course, is also a reaction to an educational restriction within Imperial Russia, where the children of the decree went, the servants, the cook women and such would not be allowed to join the gymnasium class, the classical track of education in high school. Instead, they would be sent to the Realschule, kind of the school which trades and engineering training. Yeah, future Ukraine is going to be interesting. Maybe you should take classes in Ukrainian, I'm thinking. Yeah. Yeah, we do have one at my university. It's quite fun to see what happens to these people. So one of my former students actually is now supervising the search for Ukrainian art treasures being stolen during the war. He has an office in a palace in Vienna and a significant staff and budget. Just saying, consider specializing in the region unless you want to do Kazakhstan, which is also the future, really. Also because Kazakhstan actually made a turnaround in the last month or two. Thank you so much.